The morning fog hung thick over the naval training facility as Sarah Martinez adjusted her tactical gear one final time. At 32, she had seen more combat zones than most soldiers twice her age, but today felt different. The weight of her equipment seemed heavier, each piece carefully selected for a mission that could change everything she had worked for over the past decade. Sarah had arrived at the base before dawn, her black SUV cutting through the empty streets like a shadow. She parked in the visitors section, though she knew this place better than her own apartment. Every building, every training ground, every hidden corner where exhausted recruits would catch their breath during the grueling sessions she had designed. The security guard at the gate barely glanced at her credentials. Why would he? Sarah Martinez was a legend here, even if most people didn't know her real name. For the past 8 years, she had been the ghost trainer, the mysterious woman who appeared when the Navy's most elite units needed someone who could push them beyond their limits. She had trained commandos who went on to lead classified operations in places that didn't exist on official maps. But today, she wasn't here as a trainer. Today, she was here as a target. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had received a call that chilled her blood. Someone had been asking questions about her, digging into her background, trying to connect dots that were never meant to be connected. Her handler at the agency had been brief and direct. "We think you've been compromised. Go dark until we figure out who's hunting you." Going dark meant abandoning everything. The comfortable life she had built, the reputation she had earned, the trust of the men and women she had trained. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 15 years in intelligence work by ignoring warnings. She had packed a single bag, emptied her bank accounts, and disappeared into the wind. For 3 weeks, she had moved like smoke through the underground networks she had cultivated over the years. Safe houses in forgotten neighborhoods, fake identities that could hold up under casual scrutiny, contacts who owed her favors and asked no questions. But running had never been Sarah's strength. She was a hunter, not prey, and every day spent hiding felt like a betrayal of everything she had trained others to be. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Marcus Rivera, a former SEAL who now worked private security, had reached out through encrypted channels. He had information about who was looking for her, but he would only meet in person. And he wanted to meet here, at the training facility where Sarah had first taught him how to survive impossible odds. Sarah checked her watch. Marcus would arrive in 20 minutes, expecting to find her in the old ammunition bunker where they used to conduct psychological resilience training. But Sarah had learned long ago that the most dangerous meetings were the ones that felt too convenient. Instead, she positioned herself in the observation tower overlooking the main training ground, where she could see anyone approaching from 3 directions. Her phone buzzed with a message, "Running late. Start without me." Sarah frowned. Marcus Rivera had never been late to anything in his life. Military precision was burned into his DNA, just like it was in hers. She zoomed in with her binoculars, scanning the facility for any sign of movement. The place should have been empty at this hour, but something felt wrong. That's when she saw him. A figure in tactical gear was moving through the shadows near Building C, trying to stay out of sight. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell this wasn't Marcus. The movement was wrong, too rigid, lacking the fluid confidence of someone who had been trained to move in hostile territory. This person was military, but not special forces. Regular army, maybe Navy, someone with training, but not the kind of training Sarah provided. She adjusted her position, keeping the unknown figure in sight while maintaining her own concealment. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that this was a trap. But who had said it? And, more importantly, how had they known about her meeting with Marcus? The figure stopped near the entrance to the bunker where she was supposed to meet Marcus. Sarah watched as he checked his equipment, speaking quietly into a radio. She couldn't make out the words, but the body language was clear. This was a coordinated operation. Sarah felt the familiar calm settle over her, the same feeling she had experienced in a dozen combat zones when the shooting was about to start. Her breathing slowed, her hands steadied, and her mind began calculating angles, distances, and possibilities. Whoever these people were, they had made one critical mistake. They had chosen to hunt her on ground she knew better than anyone else alive. Sarah moved through the facility like water, using passages and routes that didn't exist on any official blueprint. During her years as head trainer, she had insisted on knowing every inch of the compound, including the maintenance tunnels and emergency exits that most personnel never saw. Now that knowledge was keeping her alive, she had counted at least 4 operatives spread throughout the facility, all moving with the kind of coordination that suggested professional military training. But there was something off about their positioning. They were covering the obvious exits and approach routes, the kind of tactical setup taught in standard military academies. Sarah had taught her students to think beyond standard tactics, to anticipate the unexpected. Moving through a ventilation shaft she had used countless times to observe training exercises, Sarah positioned herself above the main corridor. Through the grating, she could see 2 of the operatives setting up what looked like a capture operation, not a kill mission. That was interesting. Dead people couldn't answer questions. Her earpiece crackled with an encrypted signal. "Phoenix, this is Raven. Do you copy?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Phoenix was her operational code name from her CIA days, known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Whoever was hunting her had access to classified information that should have been buried deeper than nuclear waste. She didn't respond. Instead, she continued moving through the facility, gathering intelligence on her hunters. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Phoenix, we know you're here. We have Rivera. If you want him alive, you'll show yourself in the main training hall in 5 minutes." Sarah paused, her mind racing. If they really had Marcus, she was facing an impossible choice. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a former student. He was one of the few people she considered a friend. He had saved her life during a mission in Syria, and she had saved his during a training accident that could have ended his career. But rushing into an obvious trap wasn't going to help either of them. She needed more information. Moving carefully through the ceiling space, Sarah made her way toward the main training hall. The facility's security cameras had been her idea, installed to monitor training exercises and identify areas where students needed additional work. Now she accessed them through her tablet, cycling through feeds until she found what she was looking for. Marcus was indeed in the main hall, seated in a chair with his hands zip-tied behind his back. But he wasn't injured, and more importantly, he was alert. Sarah knew Marcus well enough to read his body language. He was ready to move the moment an opportunity presented itself. The operative guarding him was young, probably early 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that screamed fresh out of boot camp. He held his weapon correctly but kept glancing around nervously. Sarah had seen that look 1,000 times during training exercises. This soldier had never been in real combat. That gave her an idea. Sarah accessed the facility's training systems, programs she had designed to create realistic combat scenarios for her students. With a few keystrokes, she activated the emergency lighting protocol, plunging most of the facility into darkness while bathing the main hall in red emergency lights. The psychological effect was immediate. The nervous guard jumped, his weapon swinging wildly as he tried to cover every shadow at once. Marcus, trained by Sarah herself to use every advantage, immediately threw himself sideways off the chair, rolling toward cover behind a concrete barrier. Sarah was already moving. She dropped through a ceiling access panel into a side corridor, her boots silent on the concrete floor. The red lighting created a maze of shadows, and Sarah used every one of them as she approached the main hall. Through her earpiece, she could hear panicked chatter from the operatives as they tried to coordinate in the darkness. "Lighting system malfunction," one voice reported. "Switching to night vision." "Negative," came the reply. "Phoenix is trained in night operations. Maintain visual light protocols." Sarah smiled grimly. Whoever was running this operation knew her capabilities, but they were making the mistake of preparing for the Sarah Martinez they had read about in files. They were expecting the ghost trainer, the woman who moved through shadows and struck without warning. They weren't expecting the teacher. Sarah had spent 8 years learning how these soldiers thought, how they moved, what they feared. She had pushed thousands of men and women to their breaking points and helped them find the strength to overcome. She knew their weaknesses because she had helped them overcome those same weaknesses. The guard in the main hall was scanning with a flashlight, the beam dancing nervously across walls and corners. Sarah could have taken him down silently, but that wasn't her goal. Instead, she activated another training protocol, this one designed to simulate incoming artillery fire. The sound system erupted with the thunderous roar of explosions, the bass frequencies powerful enough to shake dust from the ceiling. It was a sound that triggered instinctive responses in anyone who had been in combat, and the guard's reaction was immediate and predictable. He hit the deck, covering his head with his hands, his weapon clattering across the floor. It was exactly what Sarah had trained her students not to do, but old instincts died hard under stress. Sarah was across the room before the artificial artillery barrage ended, her hand closing over the guard's weapon while her knee pressed against his throat just hard enough to make breathing difficult. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the fading sound effects. The young soldier's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Up close, Sarah could see he was even younger than she had initially thought. Maybe 19, with the kind of earnest face that belonged in a college classroom, not a military operation. I don't know," he gasped. "They just said we were capturing a rogue operative. Said you were a traitor." Sarah increased the pressure slightly. "They lied to you, soldier. What's your name?" "Thompson," he managed. "Petty Officer Second Class David Thompson." "Well, David Thompson, you've just learned your first lesson in real-world operations. Never trust a mission briefing that doesn't give you the whole story." Sarah zip-tied Thompson with his own restraints, then moved quickly to free Marcus. Her old student was already working on his bonds, using a technique she had taught him years earlier. "Took you long enough," Marcus said with a grin as Sarah cut the remaining zip ties. "Had to make sure you weren't setting me up," Sarah replied, though they both knew she had never seriously considered that possibility. "Fair enough. We need to move. I counted at least 6 more out there, and they're not all as green as this one." Sarah nodded, but before they could move, her earpiece crackled again. "Very impressive, Phoenix. But this is just the opening move." The voice on the radio was different this time. Older, more confident, with the kind of authority that came from years of commanding respect through competence rather than rank. Sarah recognized the tone, even if she didn't recognize the voice. This was someone who had been in the field, someone who understood the game they were playing. "Phoenix, I know you can hear me. My name is Colonel James Mitchell, and we need to talk." Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus, who shook his head slightly. He didn't recognize the name either, but that didn't mean much. The military had more colonels than Sarah could count, and many of them operated in shadows deeper than hers. "You have 30 seconds to convince me not to disappear again," Sarah said into her microphone, while simultaneously signaling Marcus toward the emergency exit she had mapped out years earlier. 3 days ago, someone used your training protocols to assault a CIA safe house in Prague. Mitchell's voice was calm, professional. 2 agents are dead, and a high-value asset is missing. The attack was executed with precision that matches your teaching methods. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Her training methods weren't written down in any manual. They existed in the minds and muscle memory of the operators she had trained, and in the classified after-action reports that detailed their successes. If someone was using her techniques to kill CIA operatives, it meant either one of her former students had gone rogue, or someone had access to classified files that should have been impossible to obtain. "That's impossible," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Nothing was impossible in their world, only varying degrees of unlikely. The surveillance footage shows a team of 4 operatives moving with textbook precision through a facility they shouldn't have been able to map in advance. They neutralized security using non-lethal methods until they reached the target, then executed the guards with clinical efficiency. The whole operation took 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Sarah's mind was racing. 11 minutes was within the window she always taught for facility penetration. Non-lethal until necessary was a doctrine she had drilled into her students because dead guards couldn't provide information, but living ones could compromise an operation through early alarm. The clinical efficiency suggested emotional detachment training, another of her specialties. "Even if that's true," Sarah said, "it doesn't explain why you're hunting me instead of looking for whoever actually carried out the attack. Because, Phoenix, the stolen asset was a file containing the real names and current locations of every operative you've trained over the past 8 years, including several who are currently deep undercover in hostile territories. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If someone had that list, they didn't just have access to her former students. They had the ability to compromise ongoing operations, to burn assets who had spent years building covers in places like Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. People would die, not just her former students, but the networks they had built and the sources who trusted them. "You're saying someone is hunting my former students," Sarah said. "I'm saying someone has already started. We lost contact with 3 operatives in the past 48 hours. All of them were trained by you between 2018 and 2020. Marcus had been listening to the exchange, and Sarah could see the recognition in his eyes. He had been trained during that time period. If the list was comprehensive, his name was on it too. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. "Your help finding them before they finish whatever they started. You know your former students better than anyone. You know how they think, how they move, what their strengths and weaknesses are. We need that knowledge." Sarah considered her options. She could disappear again, fade into the networks she had built over the years, and wait for the storm to pass. But that would mean abandoning the people she had trained, the operators who trusted her to have prepared them for anything they might face. It would mean letting whoever had stolen the files continue hunting them one by one. "If I help you," Sarah said, "I want full operational control. No interference from bureaucrats who've never been in the field. And I want complete access to all intelligence related to the Prague attack." "Agreed. I also want immunity from my current operational status. Whatever agency marked me as a rogue operative, that designation gets cleared." There was a pause. "That might be more complicated. Then, find someone else to help you." Sarah cut the connection. The radio was silent for nearly a full minute before Mitchell's voice returned. "Immunity granted. But I need you to understand something, Phoenix. The people hunting your former students aren't just any operatives. The Prague attack was executed by a team trained to the same standards as your students. They know your methods because they've been taught by someone who understands your training protocols as well as you do." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the facility. There were only a handful of people who understood her methods that completely. Most of them were dead, casualties of operations in places that officially didn't exist. The few who were still alive were either deep undercover or had retired from active duty years ago. "Are you suggesting one of my former students is leading the attacks?" Sarah asked. "I'm suggesting that whoever is behind this has inside knowledge that goes beyond reading reports. They understand not just what you taught, but why you taught it. They can anticipate how your former students will react under pressure because they've been through the same training." Marcus moved closer, close enough that he could speak quietly into Sarah's microphone. "Colonel, this is Marcus Rivera. I was trained by Phoenix in 2019. If someone with our level of training has gone rogue, you're not dealing with a simple betrayal. You're dealing with someone who can think like us, move like us, and kill like us. The question isn't whether they can find our people. The question is how many they'll kill before we stop them." "That's exactly why we need Phoenix," Mitchell replied. "Because right now, she's the only person who might be able to think one step ahead of them." Sarah looked around the facility where she had spent the best years of her career, where she had helped forge the weapons that the United States deployed in its most sensitive operations. Now someone was using those same weapons against the country she had served for 15 years. "All right, Colonel," she said, "but we do this my way. I'll need complete files on the 3 missing operatives, all surveillance footage from Prague, and a list of everyone who had access to those training reports. Already being prepared. There's a helicopter landing at your location in 10 minutes. It will take you to a secure briefing facility where you can review everything we have." "And Thompson?" Sarah looked down at the young petty officer, who was watching the conversation with the wide-eyed fascination of someone realizing he was witnessing something far above his security clearance. "He comes with us. If I'm walking into a situation where I can't trust the intelligence, I want to control who has access to information about my movements." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of rotor blades began to echo across the facility. Sarah gathered her gear, her mind already shifting into operational mode. She had spent 3 weeks running from shadows. Now it was time to start hunting them. The secure briefing facility turned out to be a repurposed warehouse in an industrial district that looked like it had been abandoned since the recession. Sarah had seen enough temporary operations centers to recognize the setup. Reinforced walls, signal-blocking materials, and enough electronic equipment to coordinate a small war. The kind of place that could disappear from official records with a few keystrokes. Colonel Mitchell was younger than his voice had suggested, probably mid-40s with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of steady eyes that came from making life and death decisions on a regular basis. He stood when Sarah entered, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who knew his reputation preceded him. "Phoenix, thank you for coming." Sarah ignored the handshake, moving directly to the wall of monitors displaying satellite images, personnel files, and what looked like crime scene photographs. "Show me what you have." If Mitchell was offended by her directness, he didn't show it. He moved to a central console and began calling up files with the efficiency of someone who had reviewed the material dozens of times. Prague first. CIA safe house designated as Omega 7, used for debriefing assets transitioning out of deep cover operations. At 0347 local time, a 4-person team breached the perimeter using techniques that bypassed both electronic and human security measures. The surveillance footage was grainy, but Sarah could see enough to understand what had happened. The attackers moved with a precision that made her stomach turn. They weren't just using her techniques. They were executing them flawlessly. The way they approached the building, the formation they maintained while clearing rooms, even the hand signals they used were all variations of methods she had developed over years of trial and error. The target was Agent Catherine Walsh, recently returned from a 4-year assignment in Moscow. Mitchell continued. She had information about a network of Russian intelligence assets operating in Western Europe. The attackers killed 2 guards and extracted Walsh along with all of her debriefing materials. Sarah studied the freeze-frame images of the attackers. Their faces were obscured by tactical gear, but their builds and movement patterns told a story to someone trained to read such things. 3 men, 1 woman, all in excellent physical condition, all moving with the kind of confidence that came from extensive training and real-world experience. "Walsh was one of mine," she said. It wasn't a question. Sarah remembered Catherine Walsh as one of her most promising students, someone who had the rare combination of physical capability and mental flexibility needed for deep cover work. Trained by you in 2018. Specialized in long-term infiltration and intelligence gathering. Mitchell pulled up Walsh's training file. According to your reports, she had exceptional aptitude for adaptive thinking under pressure. Sarah nodded grimly. She had written those reports herself, noting Walsh's ability to improvise when plans fell apart and her talent for reading people and situations. Exactly the skills that would make her valuable to whoever had taken her. The other missing operatives? Mitchell brought up 2 more files. David Chun, trained by you in 2019, disappeared from his apartment in Berlin 2 days ago. No signs of struggle, but neighbors reported seeing him leave with 2 people they described as looking like federal agents. Sarah studied Chen's photo. She remembered him as methodical, almost obsessively careful about security protocols. If someone had convinced him to leave his apartment voluntarily, they had either gained his trust completely or presented credentials convincing enough to overcome his natural paranoia. And Michael Torres, trained in 2020, failed to make contact with his handler in Bangkok yesterday. Local police found his hotel room cleaned out, but security footage shows him leaving alone. Torres had been different from her other students. Where most operatives learned to suppress their emotions, Torres had learned to channel his anger into cold, calculating efficiency. He was dangerous in a way that made even experienced operators nervous, but he was absolutely loyal to anyone who earned his respect. "You think they're being recruited rather than killed," Sarah said. "It's a possibility we have to consider." All 3 operatives had skills that would be valuable to a hostile organization. Walsh's intelligence network, Chen's technical expertise, Torres's particular talents. Sarah turned away from the monitors, her mind working through the implications. If someone is recruiting my former students, they're not just after individual operators. They're building a team trained to your standards, with access to classified information about ongoing operations. Mitchell's voice was grim. The damage they could do is almost incalculable. Who had access to the training files? That's where things get complicated. Mitchell hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. The files were stored in a classified database maintained by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Access was restricted to a very small group of senior officials. How small? 12 people, all with top-secret clearance and a need-to-know authorization specifically for your training programs. Sarah felt the familiar chill of betrayal. 12 people meant the leak could be coming from anywhere in the intelligence community. Pentagon officials, CIA administrators, DI analysts. People she might have worked with, people who knew her capabilities and limitations. I need the list. Already prepared. Mitchell handed her a tablet containing 12 personnel files. We've conducted preliminary security reviews, but so far, everyone checks out. Sarah scrolled through the files, recognizing several names. General Patricia Hawkins, who had authorized many of her training assignments. Deputy Director Robert Chase from the CIA, who had provided operational support for several missions. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the DIA psychologist who had helped develop her psychological conditioning protocols. Wait. Sarah stopped on one file, staring at the photograph with growing recognition. Assistant Director Frank Morrison. You know him? He was my handler during my first 3 years with the agency. Morrison recruited me out of Army intelligence, helped design my cover identity, supervised my initial training assignments. Sarah's voice was tight with memory. He also knew me well enough to predict exactly how I would react in most situations. Mitchell moved closer, studying Morrison's file over Sarah's shoulder. He has access to all the relevant databases, detailed knowledge of your training methods, and personal familiarity with your psychological profile. There's something else. Sarah scrolled through Morrison's recent assignments. He's been tasked with reviewing operational security for deep cover assets. That would give him access to current location data for everyone I've ever trained. The implications were staggering. If Morrison had gone rogue, he didn't just have access to Sarah's former students. He could anticipate their reactions, exploit their training against them, and use his institutional authority to cover his tracks. We need to move fast, Sarah said. If Morrison is behind this, he knows we're getting close. He'll either accelerate his timeline or disappear completely. What do you recommend? Sarah studied the files again, her mind shifting into operational planning mode. Morrison trained me, but I've learned a few things he doesn't know about in the past 8 years. We're going to use his knowledge against him. She turned to Marcus, who had been quietly reviewing tactical assessments in a corner of the room. How do you feel about being bait? Marcus grinned with the kind of expression that had made enemy soldiers nervous in 3 different countries. Just tell me what you need. Sarah began outlining her plan, using the same methodical approach she had taught dozens of operatives over the years. But this time, she was planning to hunt the hunter, to use every technique Morrison had taught her against the man who had created her. If Frank Morrison wanted to play games with her former students, she would show him exactly how well she had learned his lessons. The abandoned steel mill outside Pittsburgh had been Frank Morrison's idea of a perfect meeting place 15 years earlier, when he was training a young Army intelligence officer named Sarah Martinez in the finer points of clandestine operations. Now Sarah was using that same location to bring him down. He'll expect me to approach from the east, Sarah explained to Marcus as they reviewed the facility layout one final time. That's how I always did it during training exercises. Morrison taught me to use the old conveyor system as cover, to move through the machinery rather than around it. So we do the opposite. We do what Morrison doesn't expect. We walk through the front door. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That seems almost too simple. The best plans usually are. Morrison is expecting the student he trained, someone who thinks like he taught her to think. But I've had 8 years to evolve since then. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of the elaborate infiltration Morrison would anticipate, Sarah would present herself openly at the mill's main entrance. Marcus would provide overwatch from a position Morrison couldn't have prepared for, while Colonel Mitchell's team established a perimeter to prevent escape. But the real trap wasn't the tactical setup. It was psychological. Sarah's earpiece crackled with Mitchell's voice. Phoenix, we're in position. Thermal imaging shows at least 5 individuals inside the main building, plus what looks like 3 vehicles positioned for rapid departure. Copy that. Remember, we need Morrison alive. He's the only one who knows where the missing operatives are being held. Sarah checked her sidearm one final time, then walked openly across the mill's parking lot toward the main entrance. The building loomed against the gray afternoon sky like a monument to industrial decay, its broken windows staring down like empty eyes. She had taken perhaps 20 steps when her earpiece came alive with a familiar voice. "Hello, Sarah. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be quite so direct." Frank Morrison's voice carried the same paternal warmth that had made him such an effective handler. Even now, knowing what he had done, Sarah felt a flicker of the trust he had once inspired. "Hello, Frank. I learned from the best." "Indeed you did. Though I notice you're not following the approach route I taught you. Maybe I learned a few things you didn't teach me." Morrison's chuckle carried genuine amusement. "I'm sure you did. Please, come inside. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." The mill's interior was a maze of defunct machinery and rusted catwalks, lit by shafts of dusty sunlight that streamed through broken skylights. Sarah moved carefully through the space, her weapon ready but not raised. This was theater as much as tactical operation, and every gesture would be evaluated by a man who knew her better than she sometimes knew herself. Morrison was waiting in what had once been the main production floor, standing beside a massive furnace that hadn't been fired in decades. He looked older than Sarah remembered, his hair completely gray now, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the agency's most respected operators. "You look well, Sarah. The years have been kind to you." "I can't say the same for you, Frank. Betraying your country tends to age a person." Morrison's expression grew sad, as if he were disappointed by her failure to understand something obvious. "Betraying my country? Sarah, I've spent 30 years serving this country, watching brilliant operators like yourself thrown away on missions designed by people who have never set foot in a hostile territory. I've seen friends die because politicians wanted deniable operations, and I've watched enemies walk free because bureaucrats were afraid of international incidents." "So you decided to become a traitor." "I decided to become practical." Morrison gestured toward the shadows, where Sarah could now see 3 figures positioned at strategic points around the floor. "The Cold War is over, Sarah, but the intelligence community keeps fighting it because conflict justifies budgets. Meanwhile, real threats go unaddressed because they don't fit into neat bureaucratic categories." Sarah recognized the figures emerging from concealment. Catherine Walsh, David Chun, and Michael Torres, 3 of her former students, all pointing weapons in her direction. But something was wrong with their positioning. They were covering her, but they weren't covering each other properly. Amateur mistake, the kind of thing she would have corrected immediately during training. "You're using them," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "These aren't willing recruits. You're controlling them somehow." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, I'm using them. But not in the way you think. They came to me willingly, Sarah." Each of them had become disillusioned with their assignments, frustrated by the limitations placed on their abilities. "I simply offered them something better." "What kind of better?" "Freedom. The freedom to use their skills without political constraints, to serve their country without being hampered by bureaucratic oversight, to be the weapons they were trained to be." Sarah studied her former students more carefully. They were alert, professional, but there was something off about their expressions. Too focused, too rigid. She had seen that look before, during psychological conditioning exercises. "You're drugging them." Enhanced focus medications, combined with targeted psychological conditioning. Nothing that causes permanent damage, but enough to ensure absolute loyalty and mission focus. They're better operators now than they ever were under traditional command structures. The casual admission of what amounted to mental enslavement sent a surge of rage through Sarah, but she forced herself to remain calm. Anger would cloud her judgment, and she needed every advantage she could get. "What's the endgame, Frank? You steal my students, condition them into obedience. Then what?" "Then we solve problems that the traditional intelligence community can't or won't address. Terrorist financiers who hide behind diplomatic immunity. Dictators who maintain power through Western political connections. Criminal organizations that corrupt entire governments while our hands are tied by international law." Morrison stepped closer, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he had once used to convince her to undertake the most dangerous missions of her career. "Join us, Sarah. You train these operators, but you were never allowed to see them reach their full potential. I can offer you that. No more political limitations, No more moral hand-wringing from people who have never had to make life and death decisions. Just pure operational efficiency. Sarah glanced at her former students, seeing the blank intensity in their eyes. Walsh had been brilliant, creative, capable of adapting to any situation. Now she stood like a statue, waiting for orders. Chen had been methodical, but warm, someone who maintained his humanity even in the darkest operations. Now his face showed no emotion at all. Torres had always been dangerous, but his anger had been controlled, channeled. Now he looked like a weapon someone else was pointing. You've destroyed them, Frank. I've perfected them, and I can do the same for you. Sarah's earpiece crackled with Marcus's voice, so quietly she almost missed it. Phoenix, Thermal shows 2 more tangos moving to flank your position. They'll have you surrounded in 30 seconds. Time was running out, but Sarah had one more card to play. You made one mistake, Frank. Oh, you taught me too well. Sarah's hand moved to what appeared to be a communications device on her belt, but Morrison recognized the motion immediately. He had taught her that same technique years earlier, during an exercise in psychological warfare. The building is wired, Sarah said calmly. Explosives in the support columns, triggered by a dead man's switch. If my heart stops, or if I release this trigger, the whole structure comes down. Morrison's confident expression faltered for the first time. You're bluffing. Am I? You taught me that the most effective threats are the ones your opponent can't afford to test. You also taught me that sometimes the mission requires acceptable losses. For a long moment, Morrison stared at her, his mind working through the possibilities. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing her determination against his own objectives. Then, Marcus's voice cut through the silence, broadcast on a frequency all the operatives would hear. Actually, Phoenix is bluffing about the explosives. But she's not bluffing about the cavalry. The mill erupted with the sound of tactical teams breaching from 3 directions simultaneously. Smoke grenades filled the air with thick clouds that reduced visibility to mere feet. In the chaos, Sarah moved with the fluid precision Morrison had taught her, but applied in ways he had never intended. She reached Torres first, striking pressure points that would incapacitate without permanent damage. Chen tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Sarah had trained him too well in close-quarters combat. She knew exactly how he would move, exactly where his guard would be weakest. Walsh was the most dangerous, her enhanced conditioning making her unpredictably aggressive. But Sarah had taught her everything she knew about hand-to-hand combat, and she knew the counters to every technique Walsh might use. When the smoke cleared, Morrison was in restraints, and Sarah's 3 former students were unconscious but breathing. Medical teams were already moving in to begin the long process of reversing whatever psychological conditioning Morrison had imposed. How did you know? Morrison asked as Colonel Mitchell read him his rights. Sarah looked at the man who had shaped so much of her early career, feeling a mixture of sadness and disgust. You taught me to always have a backup plan, Frank. But you forgot the most important lesson of all, which is, never underestimate the student's ability to surpass the teacher. As Morrison was led away, Sarah turned to check on her former students. They would need time to recover, time to remember who they had been before Morrison's conditioning. But they were alive, and they were safe. 6 months later, Catherine Walsh would return to active duty with a new appreciation for the psychological pressures that came with deep cover work. David Chun would transfer to training assignments, using his experience to help others recognize and resist mental manipulation. Michael Torres would retire from active operations, finding peace in teaching hand-to-hand combat to new recruits. And Sarah Martinez would disappear again, returning to the shadows where she belonged, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the greatest threats came from the people who were supposed to protect you. But that was a lesson she had learned from the best teacher of all, experience.